In the previous chapter, we talked about the up and coming War of 1812, the trouble that the United States was having with, especially the British. There were times that we were having trouble with the French, but that changed when Napoleon became the leader of France, and then we signed the treaty that took over the Louisiana Purchase. But we still continued to have issues with the British, including border disputes and the desire for Canada, and the war hawks really pushed hard for a war against the British, because that would get the fact that would stop the British from arming the Indians in the West, so the Americans could continue to move out west and be able to have more fertile planting grounds for their crops, and the land would be cheaper if they would be able to take Canada. So all those things came into play, not even including the 6,000 Americans that were impressed or kidnapped by the British. So all things are pointing towards war. And as I said in the last chapter, a war that neither the British or the Americans wanted. Most Americans didn't want it, especially up in the north, because the shipping industry would be halted. And one of our main trade partners was the British, and now we're going to be fighting them. So New England, they were ready to secede from the Union because of the War of 1812. And, the British didn't want it because the British are fighting the French in Europe. And, fighting there and then fighting another war here isn't in their best interest. But the ball was rolling. Congress voted on it successfully to have war, although it was not an overwhelming, it didn't have overwhelming support for the war. But anyways, it turns out that the War of 1812 was one of America's worst fought wars in history. We were just not ready for war. The country was not united, and there were a lot of people who just flat out didn't care. The army was small, and then they tried to make it bigger, the army, there for a while, and they were forcing the issue. And then initially in the war, the Americans were beaten back by the British up at the border between Canada and the United States, and the United States actually lost part of where Detroit, Michigan is, and part of up near Niagara Falls in New York. So we are actually fighting a war in the beginning here, thinking we're going to be successful, and we weren't. We lost more territory than we gained early on. So yeah, some the successes that we did have, though. We made it. The first attempt was going to be to go take Canada, and we had limited success. And we actually went up and won a battle at a place called York near Montreal. And on our way out of York to go continue to fight, someone made the bad decision to torch York on the way out, burn it, which goes against the rules of war, and you just don't do something like that. We will pay the price for that later on, and the British are going to try to get back at us for that. We'll talk about what they do in a few minutes here. But the success that we did have, to the surprise of many, was on water. The difference is it was on fresh water and not salt water. And what I mean by that is, the British Navy is the biggest, strongest Navy in the world. It could take over any port that they want to. That still is the case here at this time. But that doesn't mean that their fleets of ships on the lakes, especially the Great Lakes, were very strong. They were not. Oliver Hazard Perry built a fleet of American ships on Lake Erie and defeated the British. The famous quote, "We have met the enemy and they are ours," was uttered on that Battle of Lake Erie. And, it was Oliver Hazard Perry that looked like he was going to go down to defeat, but then ended up being successful. General William Henry Harrison also won a battle shortly after that. And that was big when it comes to successes that Americans had. So success on fresh water. Another big major victory for Americans in this war was the battle on Lake Champlain. The British were planning on having their fleet go down the St. Lawrence River, and then which empties out into Lake Champlain. They were going to take their crew and they were going to go into Lake Champlain and release all their troops and take over New York. That was their plan. But then General Thomas MacDonough was able to defeat the British on that lake. So oftentimes Lake Champlain is lumped in with the Great Lakes. It's not really technically one of the Great Lakes, but we won a big major battle there in December of 1914. Just talking to, I'm not talking chronologically here, but battles on freshwater lakes, it's a big success for Americans. You have to understand how what a hot spot the Great Lakes were, Lake Champlain and the Great Lakes, because it's right on the border between Canada, which is owned by the British, and the United States. So yeah, they did fight battles on those lakes. So I said I was going to tell you what happened, and why Americans why the British were going to get payback against Americans. Is angry because of what happened at York when the Americans, disobeyed rules of war and torched York on the way out of town. The British decided they were going to burn Washington, D.C. And their plan was to burn the White House and the Capitol building and any other buildings that they could burn. It was a big, huge summer rainstorm that saved the White House and the Capitol building from being totally destroyed, although they were severely damaged by the fires. It was in August of 1814 when the British troops landed at Chesapeake Bay, got out of their ships, and marched to D.C. And when they're at D.C., they set fire to the White House and the Capitol building, and then turned around and marched back to their ships and left. It was strange, very strange. There wasn't a big battle that was fought there. But it was definitely something that goes down as one of those weird things that happen in history. And there's a lot of weird things that happen in this War of 1812. Dolly Madison, who was the first lady at the time, was able to save that painting that I have right here of George Washington that's above the fireplace. And so, yeah, and then the rest of the White House pretty much was gutted. The inside, they were able to save the outside structure. The rainstorm really helped out. And then they were able to build it. At the time, it was not called the White House, though. It was called the Presidential Palace. Only after this fire, and then when they rebuilt it and then had to paint it, and to hide the scorch marks on the outside, they painted it white. That was the decision that was made. So it would then, after that, forever be called the White House. But again, not before this time. Let's talk too about the Battle of Fort McHenry, which occurred about 3 weeks after the burning of Washington, D.C. So I'm going to go back to this map right here. You can see this second arrow that goes all the way up through Chesapeake Bay to Baltimore. The British decided that they were going to bombard Fort McHenry, which was an arsenal, a British arsenal, or excuse me, an American arsenal. They knew that. They knew they had a lot of weapons there. And they decided to try to destroy it. So they sat out there and lobbed cannonballs into Fort McHenry all night long. And then in the morning, when they realized that they weren't going to be able to take this down, they turned around and left. So it goes right with the battle, not the battle, the burning of D.C. and the White House and the Capitol building as just weird things that happened. To bombard this all night and then turn around and sail away without anything happening was just, like I said, it just didn't make a lot of sense. The Americans did suffer casualties, including one African-American soldier and a woman who was cut in half by a bomb as she carried supplies to the troops. So pretty gruesome what happened there. But one of the cool things about that battle was the writing of the Star-Spangled Banner. It was Francis Scott Key, who was a Washington lawyer, who had come to Baltimore to negotiate the release of civilian prisoners of war. He witnessed the bombardment from a nearby truce ship. An oversized American flag had been sewn by Mary Pickersgill in anticipation of the British attack on the fort. When Key saw the flag emerge intact In the dawn of September 14th, he was so moved that he began that very morning to compose the poem, The Defense of Fort McHenry, which would be renamed the Star Spangled Banner and become America's national anthem. For a long time, the Defense of Fort McHenry was a bar song that they would play. And people would get drunk in bars and sing it, kind of like 99 bottles of beer on the wall type thing. But then it eventually became very popular, and then became the Star Spangled Banner, and then the national anthem. So this flag right here, this very flag, this is the one that sat above Fort McHenry, can be seen now at the Smithsonian Museum of American History. It's really cool. I've seen it. They are continually making repairs on it. As you can see, they have to sew it and attach it, because if you were to touch this flag, it would just dissolve in your hand into like just dust, basically. So they're continually trying to preserve it, but it is there for everyone to see. So there's Fort McHenry today. It's a museum. And still another one of the most strange things that happened in American history, and specifically the War of 1812, was the Battle of New Orleans that was fought a couple weeks after the war was ended. Strange, very strange. The war didn't travel very far. But it was January 8th, 1815, when the American forces, under the control of General Andrew Jackson, future President Andrew Jackson. He did an amazing job of gathering former slaves, runaway slaves, Native Americans, just anybody who was there. He created an army, basically a militia, that built up their defenses right there at New Orleans in preparation for a British attack. And the British attack finally did come, and the Americans routed them. The British losses were approximately 700 killed and 1,400 wounded. The American losses amounted to 8 killed and 13 wounded. It was a rousing American victory and led to a huge military and political career for Andrew Jackson. But the interesting thing was, the war had already ended. The treaty that was signed that ended this war, a ceasefire treaty called the Treaty of Ghent, but word had not yet got all the way down to New Orleans, so the British didn't know, and the Americans didn't know. It was the biggest American victory in the War of 1812, and it didn't count because the war was over. But what it did lead to is a feeling of pride, and this whole nationalistic pride and good feelings, like, boy, we defeated the British, and we didn't need the French to help us out, Americans felt. Here's another relic from the War of 1812. The Constitution was nicknamed Old Ironsides. Bullets couldn't penetrate her tough oak sides. This is obviously steel ships. It's now, believe it or not, the Constitution is now the oldest commissioned vessel in the United States Navy, presently serving as a museum ship at the Charleston Navy Yard in Boston, Massachusetts. So if you ever go to Boston, you could tour this ship that was used in the War of 1812. I've never seen it, but I'd love to see it. Here's a map that shows you some of the key points to this War of 1812. One is the British tried a blockade. They tried to blockade the entire east coast of the United States, plus going all the way to the other side of Florida to New Orleans. They positioned their ships obviously near places like Charleston, South Carolina, and Boston, Massachusetts, and New York Harbor, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the places where ships would come and go, to try to starve the Americans out and not allow them to get anything in or out. It had some success, but at the end of the day, not much. Also, interesting things here. You can see here's where Lake Champlain is. McDonough's defeat there on Lake Champlain. Here's Lake Erie. And, we discussed Oliver Hazard Perry's victory on Lake Erie, located right here. Here is where York is. And that's where, near Toronto, that's where the Americans burned on the way out. And that led to what happened at Washington, D.C. So you see here's D.C., the setting fire to the White House and the Capitol building. And here's Fort McHenry right there. And then here's New Orleans down in the south. So here's the thing, the big key battles that occurred in the War of 1812 as seen in that map right there. At the end of the day, they signed a peace treaty that basically stated that the war was a draw. A draw. I mean, nobody really was dominant. The biggest victory for Americans occurred weeks after the war was over. The terms of the Treaty of Ghent were status quo ante bellum. That is Latin for return to the conditions that existed before the war. No land changed hands. To Americans, that's a victory. Getting the British off our back, defeating them without the help of the French was unifying for this country, at least for a little while. It's going to lead to a period of nationalistic pride and togetherness. However, as I say that, I also want to talk about the Hartford Convention, which was a little bit about dissension. This happened in December of 1814 to January of 1815 and was occurring toward the end of the war. Basically what the Hartford Convention was, it was a anti-war protest by New England states, New Hampshire, Vermont, Rhode Island, Connecticut. And they met up there and they said, this war is awful. We are protesting it. We demand, they created a set of demands and a petition where they demanded financial assistance from Washington to compensate for lost trade because of the war going on, a constitutional amendment requiring a 2/3 vote in Congress before an embargo could be imposed, new states could be admitted, or war was declared. And they said, if we don't get our way, we are going to secede from the Union. So these New England states were ready to secede from the Union and start their own country because they were so upset about the war. Everybody that was at the Hartford Convention signed it, and they sent it to Washington, D.C. Well, mostly these are Federalists too. That's the other important thing about this. This is a Federalist-run convention. The Federalists loved the British because they traded with them and they didn't want to fight them. So the petition arrives in Washington, D.C. at about the time Americans were celebrating the victory at New Orleans. Even though it happened weeks after the war, people were still fired up about it and excited. And when this came out, it was like they looked like traitors, the Federalists and those members of the Hartford Convention. It just cast a pall over everything, and people were really upset with the Federalists, and they were really upset with this group that met in Hartford at the Hartford Convention, at this anti-war convention, because people were excited. It's going to be another nail in the coffin of the Federalist Party. I mean, they're dying out. The Alien Sedition Acts, the Midnight Judges, and now the petition about threatening to secede from the Union. And then arriving at a really bad time. Lack of communication too, another big reason why a lot of these problems are existing. So anyways, I'll talk about that political cartoon a little bit in class, but a little bit more about this second war for independence. This is a continuation really of the Revolutionary War. You could look at it that way. It brought a spirit of unity, patriotism, nationalism, and togetherness for Americans. The U.S. gained respect from other nations as they defeated the British. Heroes emerged like Oliver Hazard Perry, Thomas McDonough, William Henry Harrison, future president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, future president of the United States. Here's the other thing, too, that was big. Because of the blockade that I told you, Americans weren't getting goods from any European countries. So once again, they needed to build more factories. It was a boost to manufacturing in the United States because we're fighting the British and because of the blockade. We had to make our own stuff, and those factories are going to begin to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So manufacturing really got a boost from this war. Later on, the two sides negotiated a further agreement, a treaty. It's called the Rush-Bagot Agreement. And this is they had the Treaty of Ghent that ended the war, and they made a pact to go to the bargaining table and figure some things out later on. So this is what became of the Rush-Bagot Agreement. In this, I'm going to read this sign to you right here. A naval arms limitation agreement negotiated to demilitarize the Great Lakes and Lake Champlain after the War of 1812. This convention was concluded between the United States and Great Britain, represented respectively by Richard Rush and Charles Bagot in 1817. Under its terms, each country agreed to dismantle all armed vessels on the lakes, with the exception of 4 retained for policing purposes, and to construct no new warships. During the 19th century, there were occasional infractions of the terms, and during the Second War, they were somewhat modified. But the spirit of the convention has, in general, never been violated. Still technically in force, the Rush-Bagot Agreement has become a symbol of the long-standing peaceful relations between Canada and the United States. There are no warships that are allowed on the Great Lakes, even to this day, to prevent future wars between the United States and Canada. All right, let's talk about the American system after this. This is a post-war of 1812 political idealism. Started by, was the creation of Henry Clay. We've talked about Henry Clay before. He's from Kentucky. He's in the House of Representatives. He's very influential. He's from the Western states. And he wanted to capitalize on the good feelings that Americans were having. He wanted to capitalize on the fact that the factories are getting stronger, and he wanted to tie all parts of the country together. So this is a unifying thing. To make the country better is what Henry Clay wanted to do with his American system. Henry Clay, someone that we'll talk a lot about in this class, one of my favorite early figures in history. His American system consisted of 3 parts. Really important that you understand this. First off, a tariff of 1816. This is the first tariff in American history that would be primarily for protection and not revenue. The first tariff by Alexander Hamilton to try to pay back the assumption plan, that pay back the debt, was purely revenue generating. I did discuss it, of what a protective tariff was. Here we have the first protective tariff in American history, the tariff of 1816, that would protect all those industries and manufacturing industries that we just talked about, the ones that were created during the war as a result of the fact that we weren't getting goods from other countries. They're new, they're babies, they're infants. That's why they're called infant industries. And this tariff would protect them by putting a tax on foreign products coming in. So Americans would buy American. Now, the Second National Bank was also created. What happened to the First National Bank? Well, the charter was up in 1811. The First National Bank was a Hamilton thing, and it was passed in 1791 with a 20-year charter that was due in 1811. In 1811, we were pretty preoccupied as a country with war against Great Britain, so they let the bank lapse. So now Henry Clay says that was a mistake. We need a Second National Bank. And if we're going to be taking in money in tariffs and taxes, we need a safe place for it to happen. Of course, you're going to have your haters that aren't going to want it, but we're eventually going to get the Second National Bank. And the third part of the American system was internal improvements. An internal improvement might be a road, it might be a bridge over a river. They're really important to the country. However, this did not pass. Why? Because President Madison, who was from Virginia, vetoed the bill for internal improvements because he was a big believer in states' rights. And here you go. There's a crack in the foundation of all this good feelings going on. Southerners are fighting for states' rights because they want to keep their slaves. President Madison from Virginia, slave owner, didn't want to. Here's his mindset. If we accept money from the federal government for internal improvements, then that will give the government the right to take our slaves away. That's their thinking in the South. And here we go towards getting movements toward the Civil War, things that happened in history that got us close to the Civil War. President Madison denying his state of Virginia money from the federal government because taking that money would mean they owed the government something, or that the government would have power over them that would take their slaves away. So the plan was to funnel money from the tariff of 1816, whatever tariff money they would get, directly to internal improvements that would happen in the states, and the federal government would pay for it. And Madison says, nope. So he vetoed it, and it didn't pass. But the other two did. We did have a tariff. Southerners hated the tariff because, once again, same thing. They felt the tariff didn't benefit them in the South. They called it the tariff of abomination. They said, we don't have any industries in the South. It doesn't benefit us. And they also said, if you have the power to be able to charge us tariffs, you also could take our slaves away. That is their mindset. So the tariff and Second National Bank passed, the internal improvements did not. Now, with the death of the Federalist Party, the impending death of the Federalist Party, we are now entering into a period in history that is unique. We had one political party only, and it's called the era of good feelings. So with the death of the Federalist Party, you had only the Democrat-Republican Party. But if you don't have an opposition party, do you actually even have a political party? Everybody is going to be a member of the Democrat-Republican Party, but that doesn't mean everybody's going to fall in line and believe the same thing. So the era of good feelings, that title, it's a misnomer, meaning it's not true. It led to divisiveness, right? People that are all trying to be part of the same political party but had different beliefs. It didn't work. It didn't work. So really, it's going to lead to the death of the Democratic-Republican Party because they had no opposition. And it's going to lead to this period of sectionalism that's going to lead to the Civil War. In 1819, we had a panic, the Panic of 1819, with economic problems in this country caused by deflation, depression, bankruptcies, bank failures, and unemployment. We went through something similar in 2008. We're currently, because of the pandemic, in a recession that could turn worse. Who knows how it's going to get. So it's going to lead to a lot of this Jacksonian democracy that we'll be talking about. In the election of 1816, James Monroe is going to defeat Rufus King of the Federalists. The Federalist Party, like I said, dying out. They have virtually no power. He's winning a few states, but that's it. Monroe kept the Virginia dynasty alive. That 4 of the first 5 presidents of the United States were from the politically powerful, rich state of Virginia. Adams is the only exception. There's your 4 presidents from Virginia. Slaveholding presidents from Virginia: Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Adams was the second president. He was from Massachusetts. So what does that tell you? That just tells you that, Virginia is pretty potent politically.